1 in 3 Americans approved of the U.S. military strike on Venezuela that toppled the country's president, and 72% worry the U.S. will become too involved in the South American country. Now, this is according to a Reuters Ipsos poll. For more on this, let's now cross to SABC News correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease, who is live for us in New York. Sherwin, a very good afternoon to you. So the USA strikes on Venezuela and the deposing of its president on Saturday continue to dominate headlines, South Africa included, as you've just heard. Speak to us about the latest now, and let's start with that Reuters Ipsos poll conducted on Sunday and Monday.
You know, yesterday, Unati, we were outside the federal courtroom in downtown Manhattan, where we also saw a representation of some support for Nicolas Maduro, some protesters calling for his release. But there was also a counter-protest endorsing the actions of the United States here and pointing to the human rights violations that had become so endemic in Venezuela over the course of Nicolas Maduro's running of that country. And so you even saw the split on the streets. Now let's get into the Reuters Ipsos poll that you correctly point out was run over January 4th and 5th. And the numbers are really interesting. What it finds is that 1 in 3 Americans approves of the U.S. military strike on Venezuela that toppled that country's president. 65% of Republicans back the military operation, compared to just 11% of Democrats and 23% of independents. Let's dig a little deeper. 65% of Democrats and 35% of independents oppose the U.S. military action. So what does that then tell us from an overall perspective? That 33% support the U.S. action against Maduro, 34% are against that action, and 32% are unsure. So very divided here as to support for this initiative by the United States, a similar number against it, and then, of course, those that are saying they're not sure. Overall, the question was also asked, overall concerns that the United States would get too involved in Venezuela and the running of Venezuela's affairs. Overall, this is a good number. 72% of all adults say they were concerned of greater U.S. involvement. 54% of Republicans and 90% of Democrats say they are too concerned about getting involved. 74% of independents there. So 43% oppose Washington governing Venezuela until a new government is established in Caracas, compared to 34% in favor and 20% that are unsure. If you dig deeper into just Republican support for these actions, remember this is a Republican president of the United States, 65% support action to remove Maduro, 65% support the U.S. running Venezuela until a new government is established, 60% support U.S. military troops stationed in Venezuela. Overall, 47% of Americans are against it, 30% are in favor, so a minority are in favor. 59% of Republicans support taking control of the oil fields in Venezuela. Overall, 46% are against this move, 30% in favor. So no matter how you look at these numbers, this is a split electorate, this is a split American citizenry in terms of the actions taken by the United States. And as is so common, Unati, with anything that has a political dimension to it, who did it and what is your constituency? And that constituency, that 30%, that 33%, very much in support of the president here, essentially his MAGA base, one could argue, but a similar number against U.S. military action in Venezuela, and then that 32% that says, well, we just don't know.
I mean, I want to just also reflect on that Reuters Ipsos poll. It showed, as you're saying, you know, significant support among Republicans for a foreign policy that includes exerting influence over nearby countries. The raid itself and Trump's subsequent statements, you know, that the U.S. would now run Venezuela, it marked a sharp departure for a president like Trump, who long criticized other U.S. leaders for foreign entanglements, as it were. And just, you know, give us a sense then, Sherwin, just from post-UN Security Council's emergency meeting yesterday, especially with fears of which country Trump will target next. What are you hearing?
Yeah, that number you're talking about, right, 43% within the Republican Party, Unati, support U.S. policy dominating affairs in the Western Hemisphere. And essentially the United States is saying, you know, there was a post put out on social media yesterday by the State Department talking about how this is their hemisphere and they seek essentially to control it. What that actually means in terms of implementation, what that means for international law. You mentioned the emergency session of the UN Security Council yesterday, where the issue of a country's sovereignty, the prescripts of the United Nations Charter, things like the peaceful settlement of disputes, the fact that you can only cross a border to attack another country militarily if you invoke Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, which allows a country to defend itself, right? A repudiation of an attack, for example, or the other instances when the UN Security Council passes a resolution to endorse such military action, to give you the green light, and none of those criteria have been met here. So questions abound in terms of the rule of law, the international rules-based system. Volker Turk, for example, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, put out an op-ed that was published by The Guardian overnight, and he says the U.S. military operation in Venezuela undermines a fundamental principle of international law agreed after the horrors of 2 world wars and the Holocaust. Quote, states must not use force to pursue their territorial claims or political demands. And he echoes in that statement what South Africa's representative said in that Security Council meeting yesterday, that essentially the human rights deficiencies were well documented by the UN Human Rights Office, including a UN panel of experts that did not endorse the election win of Nicolas Maduro in the July presidential election last year. I'll just quote you essentially what they said. The UN panel of experts report found that the election fell short of the basic transparency and integrity measures that were essential to holding credible elections, and that the National Electoral Council did not even publish the results to support its oral arguments that Maduro had won. So there are certainly questions around the rule of law within Venezuela, the respect for human rights within Venezuela, very well documented by the Human Rights Office. But as South Africa said in its statement yesterday, that the allegations of internal governance challenges, human rights concerns, or acts of criminality, even by a head of state, cannot justify a breach of the Charter, the UN Charter's prohibition on the use of force, essentially, to undermine the sovereignty of states. And that is the framing here that we are grappling with, right? Does it just, people talk about Nicolas Maduro being a bad hombre, essentially, based on his human rights record internally in Venezuela. And the question then becomes, does that then justify the actions by the United States in violation of the UN Charter? Essentially, the question is, do 2 wrongs make a right? And I think we both know the answer to that.
Yeah, and I want to just, reference what was said yesterday at that Security Council. I mean, Professor Jeffrey Sachs saying that, distinguishing, in fact, members of the Security Council, the issue before the Council is not the character of the government of Venezuela. And I think enough has been said there post that election particularly. He says the issue is whether any member state, by force, coercion, or economic strangulation, has the right to determine Venezuela's political future or to exercise control over its affairs. And I think at the end of that, he then gave recommendations to the UN Security Council. So one wonders then, what direction are we going to be taking in the next couple of days or weeks?
Yeah, Jeffrey Sachs, the economics professor from Columbia University, works very much in development economics and has been a special envoy of the Secretary General on issues like the Sustainable Development Goals. But also has been a big commentator on geopolitical strife around the world. And he said this: humanity depends on whether the UN Charter remains a living document. And I think that goes to the core, essentially, of your question here. What can the UN Security Council do when a permanent member of the Council is violating the very tenets of the UN Charter that it is more greatly charged with upholding? You saw that with Russia as it invaded Ukraine. You saw the United States support for Israel, even as war crimes allegations surfaced and were taken by countries like South Africa to the International Court of Justice, right? Following a legal process, the rules-based system, which is sacrosanct in terms of how multilateral relations are engendered, have been prefaced certainly by the UN Charter. And you see the slow erosion. You see the United States, for example, sanctioning judges of the International Criminal Court that have allowed investigations against Israel and the United States vis-a-vis allegations of war crimes in Afghanistan to continue. And so they are sanctioning prosecutors of the International Criminal Court. And so there appears to be this erosion of the international rules-based system. And this is why reform of the Security Council has been such an important point, that the drumbeat continues, but the action is slow in terms of getting to a conclusion to that process. But these are examples as to why that process is needed. The question, though, is whether the veto will, at the end of these discussions, these negotiations, be removed. That is still an issue that is being grappled with. It seems unlikely that the veto is going to go anyway, because why? The 5 permanent members of the council that have the veto have the final say of whether that veto goes or not, and they're not going to relinquish that power. And you certainly are not going to see more countries get that veto, certainly in terms of the sense we're getting from those negotiations. So where do we go from here, given the fact that these are P5 members that are undermining the system?
Sherwin, thank you so much always for contextualizing as we look at the story blow by blow. Thank you so much, Sherwin Bryce-Pease, SABC News correspondent live for us in New York.